Hello and welcome to this review of my Hyper 7 Round 3 keyboard. As you can probably guess, this is a battleship-class keyboard, and I've been wanting to review one of these for ages, and thanks to mechboards.co.uk, I finally can. They were nice enough to donate one to me, fully assembled, and now I can finally show it to you in all its glory. I already had the PCBs of one of the original rounds. This is a V2 one, which was a DIY project. And when I say DIY, I do mean DIY, as the PCB had nothing on it, not even the electronic components. Now, those are already a bitch to solder on, but even then you still need a case and a plate, which is quite difficult. I think people used to make their own chassis back in those days, and finally you need the keycaps, and those are a challenge of their own. So even though I had this, it never really came to fruition. Mechboards.co.uk thankfully now sell this fully assembled version with a stainless steel chassis, so this is actually a complete fucking beast and much more approachable for people like me who can't just whip up a whole chassis themselves, let alone be fucked to do all this surface mount soldering stuff. I mean, normal switches, fine, I've soldered thousands of those by now, but surface mount components are really fucky and they're not fun to play around with. They have around 4 of this keyboard coming up soon with a fully assembled chassis like this, and even hot swap sockets, which I think is also a big improvement over this iteration. Finally, the last piece of the puzzle came when Signature Plastics, aka Pimp My Keyboard, were nice enough to send me a full Hyper 7 keycap set to complete it. I had tried slapping 2 dasher sets on it, but while it looked fancy, it really doesn't work. The big keys at the top are just too much of a problem, plus there's just not enough of the smaller keys, let alone in the right profile, let alone with the right legends on them. This one is a DSA set called Ferris. I think it looks pretty nice. Just like the Hyper 7 itself, the product link is in the description below. There were a few keycap sets printed for it, all various adaptations of Space Cadet. Personally, I do think that the Space Cadet set is the most appropriate for the board, not just because it looks awesome, but also because the Hyper 7 itself was based off of the infamous Space Cadet keyboard, which I reviewed years ago, and it aims to emulate a bunch of its keybinds. It even does the APL layer that is on the Space Cadet keycaps. That said, this Ferris set is also pretty cool, and while I typically don't like DSA profile as well as SA, it is a lot more practical for this keyboard, as uniprofile keys are much easier to swap around, so the keyboard becomes much more customizable. It's also the only set you can realistically purchase for this board, as all the other sets are now basically unobtainium. All in all, this project is quite expensive. The Hyper 7 fully assembled will retail for between £300 and £400, and the keycap set, which appears to be made to order by the way, is $250. So in total it's roughly $670 for this, which is pretty dear to say the least. Of course, a large part of that is simply due to how much keyboard you're actually getting. I mean, look at the size of this motherfucker. But what else is your money buying? Now, of course, this titanic Leviathan's immediate biggest eye-catcher is the amount of keys on it. It's usually marketed as a 173% keyboard, and it even said that on the old PCBs I just showed you, but unless I made a mistake, I counted 183 on mine, which is more than even the Deco Fast Action Mothership, and the second most of any keyboard I own currently, just behind the Acom Death Star at 189. I think you can theoretically even put 1 unit only keys at the top here instead of 2 unit ones, in which case you get an absurd 213 keys, which is more than 2 keyboards worth of buttons. But that doesn't really work with these Hyper 7 key sets. This is kind of the default setup, so to speak. We'll talk more about what to do with all this and how to set it all up, but suffice it to say for the moment that this thing is the sort of keyboard you fit a desk for, not the other way around. At just over 56 centimeters wide, I mean that's more than half a meter, slightly wider than even a battleship for fuck's sake. And you know how few keyboards can make a claim like that? I'm sure 56 centimeters is also some amount of feet, but I'm not really into foot worship, so I'm not much help there. Now, let's start with the build quality. As I mentioned, the chassis consists of 2 pillared plates, stainless steel, each one 1.5 mm thick, which is massive. And yes, it is in fact stainless steel, it's not even magnetic. Now, because of that, at first I thought it was aluminium, but the titanic weight betrays its steel nature. Stainless steel is quite uncommon in keyboards, I've found. Even my vintage steel behemoths are almost never stainless. It's roughly half again as heavy as a Model M at 3.15 kilos in total, or in herp-a-derp units, it's like totally a lot of like pounds, dude, and like, oh my god, it's like all heavy and shit. The bottom has a few soft pads as feet, which is very important because without that, this thing will slash your desk to ribbons in no time, I'm sure. Here is also the port hidden in this hole, that's pretty nicely tucked away. The port for this is mini USB because, like I said, this is an older project by now, but that's fine. Overall, the build quality is top notch. This thing can definitely take a beating, I'm sure. It's a bit open at the top, so you'll have to dust it out from time to time, but I think this will hold up to abuse very well. The keycaps are fairly thin, but they're pretty nice really. Like I said, they're uniprofile, so they can be moved around a lot, and there really are a buttload of them, including a few extras. For example, the orange keys are also present in grey, but I like the little splash of colour myself. They're dye-sublimed PBT, so very durable too, although their black on grey lettering can be a bit difficult to read at times. Still, I like this set, I think it's pretty cool. Not that you have much choice anyway, as far as I know this is the only Hyper 7 compatible set out there that you can actually buy. Now, onto the layout. Obviously this is where the real meat and potatoes is at, but many enthusiasts like those little tiny keyboards the size of a cheese grater, but those don't offer anywhere near the potential functionality of something like this. Personally, I like big butts and I cannot lie, and so this keyboard is very much for me, because a full size really is the bare minimum I can properly work with. But even for someone like me, this level of keyboardness is something to think about. Now, if you're the kind of person who can see the appeal of the unlimited power that something like this can afford you, nice. But as much as I advocate big keyboards, a warning, because if you don't actually do anything with all this extra functionality, it can actually be a detriment. So keep that in mind if you're on the fence. Let me give you an example. The stock spacebar on this keyboard, despite its giant size, is only 1.5 units long. It's surrounded by a whole bunch of keys that, by default, do all kinds of other stuff. Now this means that you either need to rebind some of these keys, or get used to a tiny spacebar like this. Similarly, control and backspace are in different locations as well. If I'm not mistaken, they were originally here, and you know, that might not be convenient for everyone, but they are important keys, so you don't want to miss them. Plus, there are all these other extra keys here, which just make the layout feel different, including having a slightly different stagger of 0.5 units uniformly on the alpha cluster, by the way. Now, I'm not going to use all these extra keys here anyway, so the way I generally fix this is by binding multiple keys to the same function to get a more familiar layout. So these keys are all control keys, these two are backspace, and these keys are all space bars. In the original layout, I found myself pressing a lot of the wrong keys, so the extra buttons were actually in the way. They made the layout worse, and that's what I mean by you really needing to customize this if you want to get the most out of a keyboard like this. I rebound a couple of things in the layout as shortcuts, macros, etc. Quite a few of them actually do what's on the keycap, so cut, paste, copy, write, that's save by the way, undo, etc. They all do what they say on the tin. These big buttons at the top here are perfect for bigger macros, plus you can swap the keycaps and functions around a lot, which really helps. With more time I could really go to town on a keyboard like this. In fact, I've been thinking about replacing my Zenith at work with this, because the bounty of macros and shortcuts and whatnot that you can get away with on this is just extremely appealing in my opinion. Honestly, with some tinkering and iterative improvements on your layout, you can massively optimize all kinds of workflows with this. Or even use it for gaming. Macros for skills in MMOs and whatnot is another thing you can easily do with this sort of keyboard. Now, in order to do all that, you need QMK, as that's what the keyboard runs on. Now, I know a lot of people like QMK, which I'll never understand. I think QMK is easily the worst program I've ever used in my entire life, and I use SAP professionally, so that's really saying something. To give you a little bit of an idea how devastating that comparison is, I'll show you a little reel demonstrating SAP in the background. This is what a very small part of the main menu looks like. In any case, back to QMK, it's probably the least user-friendly anything I've ever come across, and I'll never understand why being QMK compatible is considered an advantage in the community. And with this keyboard, it's actually worse than what you're probably used to, because this keyboard is older, so the modern shortcuts and stuff aren't all compatible with this. Thankfully, someone from mechboards.co.uk, who also happens to be in the QMK Discord community, helped me with setting it up, because I never would have figured this out on my own, and even then it took 2 hours just to figure out how to configure and flash it, and that's not counting making the layout, although in all fairness that was a doddle compared to the rest. That just took me a few minutes. Now, from my understanding, this keyboard's files aren't in the QMK repository, either because the designers of the Hyper 7 never handed it in for adoption, or because it was never accepted by the QMK database staff, in which case it was probably because it's far too complicated. The original Space Cadet keyboard was capable of 8,000 unique outputs, and the designers did just that for this keyboard as well. The default configuration that the keyboard ships with reaches nearly 8,000 outputs across 9 layers, which in professional terms is called fucking impressive. However, the fact that you can't just plonk a file into QMK configurator and do the programming from there makes this a little bit harder, also because the Hyper 7 is old enough that it isn't compatible with all the latest QMK stuff. So, like I said, someone helped me through the whole process of how to set all this shit up manually. Thanks very much again, mate. And I'll not deny that there was a considerable amount of rage on my part before I learned how to do it, but we got there in the end, and I would just edit this text file and flash it with QMK MSys when I want to make adjustments. Bottom line is, you need to configure this keyboard if you want it to be of use to you, and you need to either know a lot about QMK to configure it, or be prepared to have someone walk you through the process, because this is really quite complicated and very frustrating if you don't know what to do. So if this is something that you're not willing to do, this is probably not the keyboard for you. The switches, by the way, are Kailh Burnt Orange switches. I don't know if that's standard. I told them just put on it what you want. They're tactile switches with a somewhat stiffer weight profile than what you may be used to, at 60 grams at actuation and 80 at bottom out. I found them to be not terribly stiff, to be honest. I didn't really get tired using it, but the tactility, like all notch type switches, is rather lacking. It's very weak and not very clean. The switches feel somewhat smooth, sure, but in terms of tactility, it's not what I personally like. Thankfully, the next round uses hot swap sockets for this keyboard, so you can use something else. I'd pick either something smooth and linear, or something positive and clicky myself. But hey, to each their own. Overall, this is an incredible board. It's well made and has a crap ton of functionality. If you're willing to sink some time into setting this up properly and customizing it to fit your needs, I'm sure this will serve you very well. Of course, there is the matter of the matchingly incredible price tag as well. It's truly eye-watering, really. But unlike most of the expensive boards I review, where it's often really nice switches that are the centerpiece, or the housing, which is often CNC'd aluminium, here it's the keyboard itself that it's all about. I guess it does double as a home defense weapon, so you can save money by not having to buy a 12 gauge or something. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.